Hello. So in this video I'm going to talk to you about Mikhail Bulgakov's novel The Master and Margarita, which is one of the great masterpieces of Russian literature. It's an interesting novel, not just because it in itself is a fascinating book, but its publication history is also really interesting because so Bulgakov died in 1940, and The Master and Margarita wasn't published until 1966. And like so many of the things that occur in the novel itself that are almost inexplicable, it was the publication of The Master and Margarita was this kind of inexplicable moment where, under Soviet censorship, there was increasingly so things in the Soviet Union in terms of censorship and things like that mellowed after the death of Stalin in '53, but by the mid-'60s, as you headed into the Brezhnev era, things were starting to tighten up again. So Bulgakov's novel comes out at a time when censorship and the repression of literature and of free expression was really picking up again in the Soviet Union. And so it's an extremely critical novel. It's a satire, in part, of life in the Soviet Union and of the way that high culture was played out through ministers, through organizations, through sort of official channels and things like this. So that's one thing that's really interesting. The other thing that I think is really important is that Bulgakov himself is actually not Russian. He's Ukrainian. And so like a writer like Nikolai Gogol, who gets referenced in The Master and Margarita and who was a big influence on Bulgakov, he has this slightly outside perspective that allows him to satirize Russian culture while still being sort of insider enough, still being familiar enough. Because Ukrainian culture is not that different from, say, Muscovite Russian culture. So he's familiar enough with the culture, and of course Bulgakov, like Gogol, lived in Russia for a good portion of his adult life. And so he's got that sort of slightly outsider perspective that lets him have a slightly different frame of reference on Russian culture than most Russian writers. And so we get that same sort of satire, that same sort of social observation that we get in books like Dead Souls or The Government Inspector, both of which Bulgakov makes reference to in chapter 28, The Last Adventures of Koryaev and Behemoth. But the novel itself is actually also really interesting, even apart from that sort of socio-cultural background. It's a double-plotted narrative, meaning there are two major storylines. The first one, the main one that most of the novel is devoted to, is about Satan's visit to Moscow in the 1930s. Basically, Satan, in the guise of Woland, which is the German name for the devil, comes to Moscow to have a satanic ball. And basically sort of goes around and just causes trouble for a bunch of people. A lot of it not necessarily in itself that central to the goal of having a ball, of giving a ball, but all of these experiences end up sort of interconnecting throughout the novel, where we find out that various people know one another, or they're somehow interconnected, largely interconnected through the Moscow literary and theater scene, which of course Bulgakov himself was ensconced in, both as a writer and as a theater director. And so the devil is going around with his 3 henchmen, Koryev, who's a sort of tall, checkered, dressed guy with a broken pince-nez, which is the small glasses without earpieces. So he's the sort of main assistant who does most of the black magic, I guess. Then there's Azazello, who is a sort of smallish, red-haired guy with 1 fang and 1 blind eye. And Azazello is primarily the hitman / enforcer of the group. And then there's Behemoth, who is a large black cat. And I'm talking like small human size, not like he's large for a cat, like he's small for a person. Walks around on 2 legs. He's a kind of jester figure who delights in just causing mischief. And he also eats and drinks a lot. Azazello drinks a lot as well, but he drinks a lot more alcohol, whereas Behemoth just sort of consumes out of the joy of gluttony, I suppose. So they're just sort of going around and to a certain extent making arrangements for this ball, to a certain extent just sort of causing mischief. Like, they give a show at one of the major theaters of Moscow, and the show is an exhibition of black magic, where among the things that they do, among the tricks that they do, Behemoth pulls off the Master of Ceremonies' head and then puts it back on, which is very traumatic for the Master of Ceremonies, as you might imagine. They make money rain down from the sky, money that then later, when people spend it, turns into other things, like labels from cans or whatever it is. They give all of the women free dresses and shoes and things like that, which then disappear shortly after, leaving large numbers of high society women in their underwear in Moscow. So it's this sort of thing, where like a lot of it is quite terrible. Oh, the other member of their group, who's just sort of a servant, who's kind of there, is Hela, who is an extremely beautiful red-headed vampire who spends most of the novel naked. There's a lot of nudity in the novel, which is all just sort of incidental. Like, it gets brought up, but it's just sort of, it happens without any real commentary on it. So the other component, the other sort of element of the satanic retinue is Margarita. Because what's established in the novel is that every satanic ball needs to have a hostess named Margarita, who resides in the city that the ball was being given in. And so they apparently had gone through the phone book or something like that and checked up all the Margaritas who lived in Moscow until they found the particular Margarita who gives her name to the title. She becomes a witch and serves as the hostess of this ball, and then essentially goes away with Satan. But part of the reason that she does this is because of her love for the Master, who is basically a failed novelist who writes actually the second of the intertwined plots of the narrative. So the Master wrote a novel. He and Margarita were in love with one another, even though they were both married to other people. And while they were together, he wrote a novel about Pontius Pilate, which I'll talk more about in just a second. After his novel was rejected by the publisher for being on a religious theme, there was a campaign against him in the newspapers where a number of critics wrote about his unpublished novel, basically condemning it for being on a religious theme, which in the Soviet Union, which was officially an atheist country, it was not allowed to promote religion necessarily. So the Master has his reputation destroyed, and then basically he is denounced by another person who wants to take over his apartment, and so he gets sent to an insane asylum. Margarita doesn't know what's happened to him, but when Azazello comes along and basically says, yeah, we know what happened to the Master, we can reunite you with him, Margarita jumps at the chance. Again, she becomes a witch. There's this great, like 2 chapters long description of her just first flying around Moscow and destroying the house of this, or the apartment of this critic, one of the critics who was central in denouncing the Master, and then flying out across all of these sort of forests and to the river and things like this. And it's these sort of fantastic sweeping descriptions of these supernatural events that are really interesting in this portion of the novel. The other portion of The Master and Margarita is actually the Master's novel itself about Pontius Pilate and Jesus, but not the Jesus that people would recognize from the New Testament. This is a Jesus called Yeshua Ha Nozri, which is much closer to what Jesus probably would have been called in his own lifetime. He would have been called Yeshua and not Jesus, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew name Yeshua. And Ha Nozri means of Nazareth. So in this version, Jesus, or Yeshua, I'll call him Yeshua, has one follower, Matthew Levi, who follows him around and writes down the things that he says, but apparently out of context and not necessarily accurately, which Yeshua is not particularly pleased about. Yeshua has been denounced to the Sanhedrin and to the Romans by Judas of Kereth, who is not one of his followers. He's just a sort of random informant, apparently. And it's not really clear what his motive is in the novel, other than it seems there's some indication that Pontius Pilate actually set all of this up. But Pilate also is tormented by the execution of Yeshua. So there's some ambiguity there about Judas's role, but he's not really that central. What's really central to this other plotline is Pontius Pilate himself. And Pilate is existentially discontented in Jerusalem, or Yerushalayim, which is what the novel calls it, which is apparently an older version, an older way of spelling Jerusalem. Pilate is sort of tormented by Yeshua's philosophy, which is essentially that all people are good. And Pilate can't really wrap his head around this. But at the same time, he seemed on some level to accept it as existentially true while at the same time not believing it. So he's an interesting figure, an ambiguous figure and a challenging figure in the novel. But at the end of the novel, we actually have a really interesting component because in the last chapter, Forgiveness and Eternal Refuge, Woland, or the devil, has brought the Master and Margarita and the others to this place in the mountains where apparently Pontius Pilate and his dog have been waiting almost 2,000 years, and it's only because the Master has written the novel about Pontius Pilate, that the Master can now release Pilate from his two millennia of torture, 2 millennia of waiting, and that Pilate can rejoin Yeshua, as he's dreamed of doing, to sort of hash out these philosophical issues. And then the Master and Margarita are sent to eternal peace. And again, it's a really interesting conclusion because Matthew Levi comes to Woland and basically says Yeshua wants the Master and Margarita to have eternal peace, and the Master says, yes, I had already planned to give them that. So we have here the sort of convergence of Jesus and the devil both aiming to provide eternal peace to these two protagonists of the novel who've suffered.